was early the next morning, and his head kind of plopped over the upper bunk and looked down at Charlie, and it was red. His hair was a mess, going all different directions. And he said, Charlie, let's go to the bathhouse. Charlie looked up, trying to figure out who it was. Charlie didn't do very well in the morning. He wasn't a morning person. It took him a little while to recognize where he was, figure out he was at camp. But finally, he kind of clued in. I'm at camp, it's in the morning, and Red and I talked about the night before, about getting up early, going down to the bathhouse, and making sure we got a nice hot shower and change clothes. Charlie said, let's remember, he said Uncle Jeff said we could get up if we were really quiet. So as quiet as they could, they got all of their stuff together. They got the clothes they were going to wear that day, fresh set of underwear, socks and shoes, and they wrapped them up in the towel, and they slowly walked toward the front door. Now this is an old cabin, and the floor creaked as you walked. So instead of walking with big heavy steps, they just kind of glided across the floor as quiet as they could. They made it to the front door. It was a screen door. They opened it. Yep. It creaked just a little bit, and they squeezed out. And off down the steps they went toward the bathhouse. They had to go down this trail, and it was early. It was almost light, but not quite light. And they had bundled their stuff all up in a towel to go down. And as they walked along, Charlie would have to tell Red, you dropped your socks. Red would turn around and pick up his socks. As they continued to walk a little further, Charlie would have to say, Red, you dropped your shorts. He stopped and picked up his shorts. They finally made it to the bathhouse. And when they walked in, just before they walked in, they had left the light on the night before, and the wall was covered with moths. And as soon as they touched the door, the moths started flying everywhere. Got on their head, got in their face, on their arm and stuff, and they were shaking them off, and they, as quickly as they could, got inside. When they got inside, they found that there was already a group of boys there. They looked over in the corner, standing in the corner at the sink, combing his hair. Yep, just like you would suspect. It was Muscle Mike. And he was down there getting ready, because it took him a little while to get ready in the morning, to get all that hair in the right spot, and get his t-shirt all straightened up and his little gold chain. And when he saw Charlie come in, he goes, woo-hoo, Sunday school Charlie's here. And he made a little song and started singing, making fun of Charlie. And then he looked over and said, and his sidekick, red-headed Red. He didn't like Charlie and Red, and he made fun of him. About that time, he walks over to him and says, hey, did you sleep with your Sunday school pen last night, Charlie? What about your keys? Were they under your pillow? And Red, it made him mad. Now, you got to understand, Red has not been to church as many times as maybe Charlie had. And so he was kind of a new Christian. Red still had a temper. A lot of redheads have tempers. And he looked up at Mike and said, hey, you stop talking to my friend that way. You do it again. Well, that kind of took Muscle Mike back. He startled him almost, thinking, who is this guy? But then he just started laughing, because that's what some people do. When they try to cover up fear, they laugh a little bit. And so he laughed and said, yeah. We'll talk to you boys later. And he got his stuff together, put it in this little bag, and walked out the door, turned around, kind of smirked and smiled at Charlie and says, I'll see you boys later. And out the door he went with his friends. Charlie looked at Red. Red looked at Charlie. Charlie looked at Red. And Red looked at Charlie. And they both took a deep breath. Because they didn't know what was fixing to happen. And they were sure glad those guys were gone. But Charlie began to think, because Charlie's always thinking this way. He says, I wonder if Muscle Mike really knows Christ. I wonder why he's here at camp. And he looked at Red and said, Red, I think we ought to pray for him. And Red said, no way, Jose. I'm not praying for him. He doesn't need our prayers. But Charlie says, yes, he does. There's something I know that's not right in his life, and we need to pray for him. Red just kind of shook his head and said, I don't know. Let's hurry up and get our showers. Let's get back up. So they got their showers, got dressed in their favorite clothes for the day, and off they went back to the cabin. That morning at 10 o'clock, they heard the bell ring. This was after breakfast and cabin cleanup. They heard the bell ring, and it was telling them to go down to the lodge for their Bible study time. As they walked in the door, there were other campers everywhere, and they were talking and gabbing, and then this young lady got up and started leading singing, and after the singing, the camp director got up and introduced the Bible teacher for the week. And the Bible teacher's name was Mr. Hunt. Charlie he didn't recognize him, but he just kind of had a feeling that this man's going to be a great teacher. Just because of the way he smiled and he looked and he was greeting kids before they'd ever started. And so Mr. Hunt comes up and he says, boys and girls, we're going to be here together for a week. And I've got some stories I want to tell you from the Bible. And the first story I'd like to tell you is about a boy that grew up in Palestine. Now this young boy, his name was Joseph. And Joseph had 3 things happen in his life. The first thing, he was betrayed. The second thing, he was blamed. And the third thing, he was blessed. And so Mr. Hunt began to tell this story, real vivid, about Joseph and his life. He tells him that he has 11 brothers. And he was the youngest. And his brothers would always go out into the field and on the hillside, and they would take care of the sheep that belonged to their father. And they would spend days and days out there. Joseph never could go. He had to stay at home. At times the boys would come back and the sheep, and maybe they'd sell the sheep and get new sheep and start again. But one time when they're all back at the house, it says that Joseph's father came out and brought him a coat of many colors. Now, a coat of many colors was a special thing. Most of the things they used to wear were just, plain colored. But when you got something that had vivid, bright colors in them, that was significant, special. And Joseph put it on, and maybe knowingly or maybe not knowingly, he would kind of say, look at what I've got. Well, you can imagine what older brothers thought. They were jealous, they were mad, and they didn't want to see or hear anything about a coat of many colors anymore, especially from Joseph. Off they went. They had to travel to a distant area in the country there to find grass for the sheep. And Joseph's dad became a little bit concerned of how his sons were doing. So he said, Joseph, I want you to go, I want you to find your brothers, see how they're doing, and come back and tell me. Joseph grabbed his coat of many colors. He probably grabbed a little bag with some food for a lunch or two, and off he went. As he was coming toward his brother's camp, where the sheep were out in the field, and they were camped out, they saw him in the distance. They began to talk. Here he comes. Here he comes, Joseph, the boy with the coat of many colors. That really made him mad. It made him so mad that one of the brothers, Reuben, says, I got an idea. Let's take him and let's kill him. Well, that's pretty serious. They said, no. No, actually, Reuben spoke up and said, no, let's not kill him. Let's just take him and throw him in one of these pits nearby and just kind of scare him. So when Joseph came, they took the coat off, grabbed him, and tossed him in a pit. Now you just think about your brothers or your sisters doing that to you. They hate you so much, they grab you, and they throw you in a pit, leave you in there overnight, and they begin to think about what they're going to do to you. Well, off in a distance, they see a caravan of camels and people traveling to Egypt, merchants. They had been carrying probably stuff that they had bought or had grown or purchased on the way to take back to Egypt. And they said, I've got an idea. Let's sell him to them. So they got Joseph out of the pit, took him to the caravan of travelers and merchants, and they sold him. When Joseph finds himself in Egypt now, he is asked to work as a slave, if you will, in the house of a man named Potiphar. When he went to that house, Joseph did something very unusual, because Joseph was a very unusual boy. Joseph had a real understanding of who God was, a fear of God, a desire to be obedient to God, a desire to show his love of God by the way he worked and what he did. It did not take long for Joseph to be the head of Potiphar's house. That means he was taking care of all the affairs, buying of the food, keeping of the animals, taking care of the house. Well, one day, Potiphar's wife, who was not a nice lady, came to him and said, "Hey, I think you're good looking, and I want to spend a little time with you." And Joseph knew, ooh, this is not going to be good. This is not right. She comes to him again. This time, she grabs a hold of his coat. But Joseph runs away, breaks free. Because he knew it was wrong for him to be close, to have that kind of friendship or relationship with someone else's wife. That was wrong. And so he ran away. Now, that made Potiphar's wife very mad. And so she went to her husband and accused him of doing something very wrong. Now, that put Potiphar in kind of an interesting position. Believe his wife? Believe Joseph? Well, he went with what his wife said. And took his servant Joseph, and he was thrown into jail. You see, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. He was blamed for something he did not do by Potiphar's wife. And now we find him in prison. Who else did we find in prison today? When our story time, remember in devotions, we found Paul was in prison. Now we find Joseph in prison. You know what Joseph did? Joseph did not sit around and complain and whine about his condition. But instead, he took the condition he was in to bring glory to God. And he begins to be obedient to those that were telling him what to do. And they saw in Joseph, this is a man that we can give responsibility to. This is a man that's respectful. And Joseph grew in the prison to the point that he was in charge of the prisoners. Being faithful to God, obedient to God, respecting those in authority, even in prison. Well, one day, a servant was sent to Joseph. And he said that Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, had a dream. And it's really just driving him crazy. He just doesn't understand it. Many people have tried to come and tell him what that dream meant, but nobody could do it. Joseph went to him. He got cleaned up, walked into the Pharaoh's presence there in the palace, and he says, "I've got a dream." And Pharaoh told him the dream, and Joseph responded, "Your dream means this: Egypt is headed toward a famine. But first there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine." Pharaoh said, "That's it. That's it." And out of his respect for Joseph, he placed Joseph in authority second in all of Egypt, just under Pharaoh himself. And now Joseph is going around ruling the whole nation of Egypt. So we find Joseph, the young boy with the coat of many colors, who was in the pit, thrown there by his brothers and betrayed. Then we find him serving in Potiphar's house, and then we find him in prison, and now he's in the palace, ruling over all of Egypt. God took Joseph, a young man who did not take his condition that he was in, and use it as a circumstance to turn away from God, but took the condition that God put him in and used it as an opportunity to glorify God. It's interesting. Charlie began to think about this. That must mean, I know what that verse means now. Romans 8:28. For God works all things together for good, to them that love God, and to them that are called according to his purpose. Joseph didn't know that verse, but Joseph knew that principle. He knew the truth of that because he saw it lived out in his life. Now, Charlie began to think, as the Bible study came to the end, Mr. Hunt was wrapping up just before the prayer, and he began to think, I can see that maybe here. I don't understand why Muscle Mike is here. I don't understand why he's kind of being a bully to me. But maybe there's something that God wants to do in his life and my life this week. And Charlie just said a word of prayer. he said, Lord, help me to love my enemies. Help me to bless those that hate me. Help me to do good to those that curse me. And help me, Lord, to pray for those that despitefully use me and persecute me. And that verse just started to mean more and more to Charlie each day. Well, it was time to go back to camp activities. They did all kinds of things the rest of the day. A great lunch. Then they went off to a rest period. And then they had the study time. And then they went swimming. And then they did some sports. And then they had a snack. And then they had a great supper and time of fellowship and activities and games. Celebration took place. But before celebration, something happened. They were on their way to the lodge, and Muscle Mike came running past them. Kind of bumped into Charlie's shoulder, but Charlie didn't take it as a negative. He said, "Hey, Mike, how you doing?" Mike looked around and said, "What do you want?" And he walked away. But as he walked away, he stopped for a moment, and he looked down, and he reached down, and it looked like he picked up something and put it in his pocket. And he turned around and looked at Red and Preston. And Red said, "What'd you find?" He looked at him. "None of your business," said Muscle Mike. And he walked away. Well, that night after celebration and devotions, Uncle Jeff said, "Guys, I've got to tell you something." They were back in the cabin of Timber Ridge, all ready for bed. Something's happened. This afternoon, Miss Eloise was walking from the dining hall to the lodge. And in her sweater, she always wears a sweater, doesn't matter what time of year it is, or summer or anything. She just always wears a sweater, has her hair up in a bun, and she just kind of waddles when she walks. And as she came across the grass, she dropped the key to the treasure chest that held all the money that the campers took and gave on the day of registration. And she can't find it anywhere. Uncle Jeff said, this is a problem, because that's a specially made treasure chest that the camp was given by some missionaries from Germany. And if we don't find it, they'll have to take a hammer and a crowbar, break it loose, and they'll probably break the lock and the hinges to get in there to get the money. Red looked over at Charlie. Charlie looked over at Red. Red looked over at Charlie. Charlie looked over at Red. And they looked at one another. And tomorrow, we'll find out what happened.